My name is Delia Hartley. I am 37 years old, and I found out my mother had sold my vineyard when I saw two strangers in reflective vests driving survey stakes into the row my grandmother planted the year I was born. 9 days later, I stood in the middle of my sister's brand new luxury boutique in downtown Ithaca, holding a glass of champagne that had been paid for with my stolen inheritance, while my mother raised her own glass in front of 120 guests, pulled my sister against her hip, and said, "And of course we have to thank Delia. Her little grape farm finally did something useful. It funded the daughter who actually knew what to do with money." The room laughed, not cruelly, warmly, because every single person there believed I had said yes. My sister looked at me over the rim of her glass with that soft, patient smile she used when she was waiting for me to swallow something and pretend it tasted fine. That's what I had always done, 37 years of it. So I smiled back. I walked up to the little platform, close enough that the microphone caught every word, and I said one sentence. "Tomorrow morning at 9, sign for the envelope, and read it alone." My mother's face changed for maybe half a second, just the eyes. But I saw it. By 10:30 the next morning, my phone showed 87 missed calls. One voicemail began with my mother sobbing, shifted into screaming, and ended mid-sentence, "You can't touch the store. Bree already signed the." I listened to it exactly once. Then I put the phone face down on my kitchen table and opened the last document my attorney had sent me at 6:04 that morning. My mother thought the envelope was a threat. It wasn't. It was a map. A map of every single thing she was about to lose, drawn by a court, in her own handwriting using the trail she had left herself. Before I tell you what was inside it, and why one sentence made a woman make 87 phone calls in a single morning, do me a favor. Tell me what time it is where you are and what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story traveled. And stay with me, because the part that broke me wasn't the forged deed. It was one email from my sister that had a heart emoji at the end of it. Let me take you back 4 years. My grandmother, Adelaide Hartley, everybody in Schuyler County called her Addie, died in February of a bad winter, in the same iron bed she'd been born in. She left me Larkspur Hollow, 22 acres of Riesling and Cabernet Franc on the east slope above Seneca Lake, just outside Hector, New York, along with the press house, the 200-year-old barn, the lake-fed water rights, and every single dollar of debt attached to the operation. 22 acres, 41,000 vines, 6 employees, and a note in her handwriting taped inside the tasting room door that said, "Delia, the ones who show up in February get the land." That was the whole argument right there, and my family never forgave her for making it that simple. I had spent 14 summers on that slope. I learned to prune when I was 9, standing on an upturned crate so I could reach the cordon. I learned to read a refractometer before I learned to drive. My grandmother taught me to take a grape between 2 fingers, crush it gently, look at the seed, chew the skin, and only then trust the sugar number. "Numbers tell you when the fruit is ready," she said. "Attention tells you whether the land will outlive you." That sentence built my entire career. I became a soil and water consultant. I go into failing small vineyards and orchards from the Finger Lakes down through Virginia and help them cut irrigation, stop erosion, rebuild depleted ground, and qualify for regenerative certification. I'm good at it. Every dollar Larkspur Hollow made in those first 4 years, I put straight back into the dirt. New drip lines, cover crop, a rebuilt drainage swale on the north block, cold hardy rootstock trials. My mother, Corinne, looked at the same 22 acres and saw one number, the appraisal. $2.1 million, sitting there doing nothing, in her opinion, but growing fruit. My younger sister, Bree, looked at it and saw money I was selfishly leaving in the ground. Neither of them ever mentioned February. Bree is 29, and Bree has always been the family's beautiful emergency. 3 jobs in 2 years. A wedding planning business that lasted 1 season. A candle line. She has the kind of face that makes strangers want to fund her. And my mother has spent 3 decades confusing that with potential. Last spring, Bree announced that luxury retail was her true calling. She found a storefront on the Commons in Ithaca, corner unit, huge windows, foot traffic, and she needed $260,000 for the lease Italian shelving, an imported marble counter, a designer inventory buy, and a launch agency. She brought a mood board to that dinner. 14 pages of fabric swatches, fonts, and photographs of other people's stores. No projections, no lease terms, no break-even analysis, nothing about margin, sell-through, or what happens in a college town in July when the students leave. My mother waited until dessert, then said, "So, Delia, you'll help your sister." Not will you, not can you. You'll help your sister. The number had already been decided before I sat down. I said yes, with conditions. I offered to review the numbers with her line by line, negotiate the lease myself, introduce her to 2 people I knew in wholesale, and put in $20,000 of my own money once she'd built an actual budget and secured independent financing so the whole thing didn't rest on one family's cash. Bree shoved her chair back so hard it barked against the floor. "You're humiliating me," she said, in front of Mom. And my mother, I remember exactly how she folded her napkin, said, "Your grandmother gave you more than enough, Delia. It isn't right for one sister to sit on all the family's security." I told her the truth, that the Vineyard was not a family bank account, that it was legally mine, operationally fragile, mortgaged, and already carrying 6 people's paychecks and health insurance. She stood up, put her hand flat on the table, and said the sentence I would think about for the next year and a half. "One day you'll learn that land matters less than people." 3 months later, a cream-colored envelope arrived at my house, heavy paper, gold foil. "You're invited to the grand opening of Saffron and Slate, Friday, September 26th, 6 o'clock. A $260,000 boutique that apparently no longer required my cooperation. I stared at that invitation for a long time, and here's the thing I want you to understand, because it's the part people always skip when they hear a story like mine. I didn't feel suspicion. I felt relief. I actually thought, good, she found real financing. She did it without me. Maybe I was wrong about her. That's what a lifetime of being the family's problem solver does to you. When the bill stops coming, you feel grateful instead of curious. The first real warning came 13 days before the opening. At 5:41 on a Monday morning, my bank sent an alert: 2 failed attempts to access the Larkspur Hollow operating account. Location, Watkins Glen, my mother's zip code. I sat up in bed in the dark and told myself a story. Old shared login. She'd helped me with payroll once, back when I broke my ankle. Probably an autofill error. I changed every password anyway, added 2-factor, and went to make coffee with my hands shaking slightly, and I couldn't have told you why. At noon, I called Marisol Duarte. Marisol has managed Larkspur Hollow for 11 years. My grandmother trained her. She knows those blocks better than I do. She was quiet for a second, too long. Then she said, "Delia, I was going to ask you about this. A woman came by last week, said she was with the new ownership group. She wanted our water usage records, the yield estimates, and the well log." I said, "What new ownership group?" And Marisol said very carefully, "Your mother brought her. She had paperwork. It had your signature on it. She said you'd authorized a confidential sale and you didn't want any calls until the transition was finished because she stopped, because you were dealing with something private." I asked her if she'd given anyone the keys. "No," she said. "I told them the equipment stays with the owner. But Delia, I thought maybe it was a family thing you hadn't told us about yet. It's your mother." That's the part that still turns my stomach. My mother didn't just forge a document. She weaponized the fact that I'm a private person. She used my own reputation to make good, loyal people distrust their own instincts. Marisol had been standing in that press house feeling guilty for doubting my mother. I drove out to Hector that afternoon, 40 minutes on Route 4014 with the lake flashing between the trees, and I don't remember a single mile of it. My grandmother's sign was gone. The hand-carved oak one, Larkspur Hollow Est, 1961, that Addie's husband made with a chisel and a bad back. In its place was a temporary aluminum board on 2 posts. Future home of Halcyon Shores, a lakeside wellness retreat. Orange survey flags ran in a straight line across the old block. Right through the vines my grandmother planted in 1988, the year I was born, the ones she always called Delia's Rose, in a voice that made it sound like a joke and a promise at the same time. A man in a fleece vest with a clipboard walked over, stuck out his hand, and said, "You must be Delia. Congratulations on the closing. This is going to be beautiful." I want to be honest with you about what happened in my body in that moment. My ears rang, my mouth went completely dry. I heard myself say in a totally level voice there was no closing. I never authorized a sale. I watched the color leave his face. He was a decent man having the worst afternoon of his quarter. He took me into the site trailer and opened his file, and there it was. A recorded grant deed. Larkspur Hollow, 22 acres, transferred for $1,400,000, $700,000 below the appraisal I had commissioned 8 months earlier. My name was at the bottom in careful, looping cursive, except it said Delia R. Hartley Kane. I dropped Kane in my divorce. 6 years ago. I haven't signed that name since 2019. My mother copied it off an old document because she liked how it looked, because it was the version of me she preferred, the married version, the manageable version. And the notary block placed me in an office in Corning, New York, on August the 11th at 2:15 in the afternoon. On August the 11th, I was in Charlottesville, Virginia, giving a 90-minute keynote on dryland soil recovery to 400 people, live-streamed, timestamp. I did not cry in front of that man. I photographed every single page of his file, asked him in writing to halt all non-essential site work, thanked him, walked out, got into my car, closed the door, and then my hand started shaking so badly I couldn't get the key into the ignition. I sat there in the gravel looking up at those rows, and I remembered my first harvest. 5:30 in the morning, fog sitting on the lake, my grandmother's flashlight, her cutting open a grape with her thumbnail and holding it up to the beam. Owning something isn't the right to use it up, Deli, she said. It's the job of handing it over alive. My own mother had converted that job into marble countertops and silk dresses. I pulled up her contact. My thumb hovered over the call button for a long, long time, and I need you to understand why, because I think some of you are in this exact position right now. I didn't want to yell at her. I wanted her to explain it away. I wanted there to be a version of the story where I got to keep being her daughter. Then my phone buzzed in my hand, another bank alert. Someone had just attempted a password reset on the Vineyard account, again. 14 minutes ago. She wasn't finishing. She was still going. I locked the phone, started the car, and chose evidence over an explanation. That was the moment everything turned. Not the sign, not the deed, that. And here's where it stopped being about a signature, because what I found in the next 72 hours wasn't a moment of panic. It was a plan, and there was a second person in it. The Schuyler County Clerk's office confirmed the deed had been recorded 12 days earlier. 12 days. While I was texting my mother pictures of a cover crop trial, and she was replying with heart emojis. I paid for a copy of the full escrow file, and I read it in my car in the parking lot with the engine running because I couldn't feel my feet. It contained a durable power of attorney authorizing Corinne Hartley to act on my behalf in all real property matters. I recognized the form. It was the one we'd all signed when my grandmother was dying and everyone was terrified and papers were flying around a hospital room in Elmira. My mother had kept a blank second copy. She had filled it in, dated it this year, and used it. It contained a color scan of my expired New York driver's license, the one I keep in a locked file box in the second bedroom of my house. In a house she still had a key to, because 2 years ago I broke my ankle on the barn stairs and she drove up to feed my dog and I never asked for that key back because she was my mother. That's what I've learned about trust. It isn't a feeling, it's an access level. And some people treat access as permanent the second you grant it once. And it contained the money. $1,400,000 had landed in a brand new account controlled solely by Corinne Hartley. From there, $260,000 wired to Saffron and Slate Elsie Hay, $186,000 to credit cards, a home equity line, launch fees, and a marketing agency in Rochester. Just under $12,000 on furniture, which left about $940,000 still sitting there, with 3 large transfers marked pending. I sat in that car and did the coldest arithmetic of my life. If I called her right then, if I screamed at her the way every cell in my body was demanding, she would have moved that $900,000 in a single afternoon into Bree's business account, into a loan to a cousin, into anywhere. Rage would have felt incredible for about 90 seconds and cost me everything. So I did the hardest thing I have ever done. I drove home, ate a piece of toast standing up at the counter, and called a lawyer. Pryor Raghunathan is a real property litigator in Rochester. I'd met her 4 years earlier on a conservation easement for a client's orchard. I sent her the deed, the escrow file, the notary block, the bank alerts, the Charlottesville live stream, my flight records, my hotel folio, and the survey photos. She called me back at 9 that night, and the first thing she said was, "I need you to hear something before you get hopeful. This is not going to be clean." Halcyon Shores had paid real money. They believed in good faith that they'd bought that land. A forged deed is void, but voiding it takes a court, and in the meantime a developer with lawyers and financing has every incentive to fight. The land could be cleared, the money could vanish, and the second we filed anything, my mother would know. "Here's what wins," Priya said, "not your anger, your paper. You have one advantage right now, and it's an enormous one. She thinks you don't know. Do you understand what that's worth?" I said yes. She said, "Then I need you to keep being her daughter for about 10 more days. Can you do that?" Have you ever had to smile at someone while a courier was already carrying your evidence across a county line? Over the next 8 days, I built a case out of the wreckage of my own family. I rebuilt August the 11th minute by minute, the boarding pass, the East Pass records, the rental car agreement, the hotel keycard log, the conference program with my name on page 4, and 41 minutes of live stream video where I am visibly standing at a podium in Virginia at 2:15 p.m. The exact minute a notary in Corning swore I was in front of her. I compared the forgery to 15 years of my real signatures. My actual business signature is a fast, ugly D. Hartley, the kind of scrawl you develop after signing 400 invoices a year. The forgery was slow, careful, and beautiful. It was copied from my 2011 passport application. My mother had traced the daughter she remembered instead of the woman I'd become, and it was the single most damning piece of evidence in the file. Then I called the notary. Her name was Gwen. She picked up on the second ring, and when I read her the commission number, she went silent, and then she said, "Ma'am, I surrendered that seal 19 months ago. I reported it missing when my office moved. I have the paperwork." She signed an affidavit 2 days later. That's the moment suspicion became a traceable crime with a date on it. Marisol forwarded me the email my mother had shown her at the press house. It came from DeliaLarkspurHollowKnee.com. My domain is larkspurhollow.com, no hyphen, no nigh. That fake domain was registered 19 days before my mother's visit, paid for with a card ending in the same 4 digits as her home equity line. It instructed Marisol to cooperate with the new ownership team, to keep it quiet, and to tell the crew I was restructuring for personal reasons. She built an entire second version of me and hired her out to lie to my employees. And then Priya found the escrow correspondence, and that's where I stopped being able to protect anybody. To rush the closing without me, my mother had told the escrow officer that I was in New Zealand on a 6-month soil research fellowship in a remote area with unreliable communication, that I had asked her to handle everything, and this is the line I have never been able to fully forgive, that I was recovering from a difficult year and should not be contacted directly because stress could set me back. She invented a fragile, faraway, damaged daughter. She used my divorce as a prop. Attached to that thread was one more email from Bree to my mother, dated 4 days before the closing. "Send our portion first. The opening date can't move. The agency is already booked, and I've committed to the fixtures." My mother's reply, "It'll be fine. Delia will be angry for a while, but by the time she really understands what happened, the store will already be open and doing well. She's practical. She'll come around." And Bree's answer, the entire message, was, "You always find a way." Up until that moment, I swear to you, I had built a small room in my head where Bree was innocent, where my mother had lied to her too, where my little sister thought the money was a legitimate family loan. I needed that room. I had been protecting her since she was 3 years old. That email burned the room down. She may not have forged the deed, she may never have touched it, but she knew the entire plan depended on moving faster than my understanding, and she chose the opening date anyway. She chose marble. I sat in my truck outside the post office in Watkins Glen, and I almost called my mother. Not for evidence, not for strategy, just because I was 37 years old and I wanted my mom, and the person I wanted comfort from was the person who did it. I put the phone in the glove box. Priya got us an emergency hearing. 7:30 in the morning, Monday, September 29th. 3 days after the grand opening. She told me not to go to that party. She said no good comes from being in a room with people you're about to sue, and she was right about the risk, but she was wrong about the strategy, and I told her why. My mother had spent 2 months telling relatives, vendors, the Merchants Association, and half of Schuyler County that I was a proud, generous investor in my sister's dream. If I vanished, if I refused the invitation, she got to write the story first. Delia got jealous and backed out, and now she's being vindictive. Every relative would arrive preloaded with her version. But if I walked in, said nothing, confirmed nothing, and let 120 people watch her tell that lie with my face right there in the room, then when the truth landed 48 hours later, every one of them would remember exactly where they'd been standing when she said it. And there was the harder reason, the $900,000. As long as my mother believed I was clueless, that money sat still. The party was the safest place in the world for it. So I went, and the night before I wrote a letter. 1 page, no insults, no pleading, no how could you. I read it back 11 times and cut every emotional sentence because I have learned that people like my mother can survive your pain indefinitely. It's your paperwork they can't survive. It said that Larkspur Hollow was never hers to sell, that my signature was never hers to borrow, that my grandmother's will was not a suggestion she was entitled to correct, that being my mother did not place her above the law of New York State. And the last line said, you taught me that my silence meant permission. Tomorrow you learn the difference. Saffron and Slate opened on Friday, the 26th of September at 6 in the evening, under white hydrangeas and a hand-lettered gold awning. It was beautiful. I want to be fair about that. It was genuinely, expensively beautiful, poured concrete floors, brass rails, a marble counter with a single vein of gray running through it like a fault line, mirrors imported from Milan, a fitting room behind heavy velvet, and I couldn't stop translating it. The marble counter was the drainage swale on the north block. The chandelier was 3 employees' health insurance contributions for a year. The designer inventory hanging on those brass rails existed because 41,000 vines and 1 dead woman's handwriting had been converted into a trace signature. I wore a plain navy dress and I came alone. My mother crossed the entire store the second she saw me. She kissed my cheek, held my elbow, and whispered, I'm so glad you decided to be mature about this. Mature. That was the word she used for a daughter she'd robbed showing up quietly. Bree came over in a white suit from her own opening collection, and for about 4 seconds both of them studied my face the way you check a smoke detector. I congratulated my sister on the turnout. I said the light in the front window was perfect. I said nothing at all about the vineyard. I watched their shoulders come down, both of them, in unison. My mother handed me a glass of champagne bought with my money. I held it for 2.5 hours and never drank a drop. And then the guests started coming up to me. Delia, you're such a good sister. Corrine told us what you did. That's real family. A woman from the Ithaca Merchants Association squeezed both my hands and said, this is what it looks like when women lift each other up. Every compliment landed like a small stone in my chest, because they hadn't just stolen from me. They had cast me as a witness for the theft. They had made my presence into evidence of my consent, so that any objection I ever raised would automatically sound like betrayal. I wanted to climb on the counter and scream that generosity requires consent. That's the whole difference between a gift and a robbery. One sentence freely spoken by the person who owns the thing. Instead, I walked the store with my phone out like a proud sister taking pictures, and I photographed the marble, the chandelier, the fixtures, the inventory tags, the serial number on the point-of-sale terminal, and the delivery invoices stacked behind the register, and I texted every single one too. Priya, who was building an asset schedule in real time from her kitchen table in Rochester. At 6:52, while Acellas played near the fitting rooms, a bonded courier picked up a sealed envelope from Priya's office. At 7:15, Bree tapped a spoon against a glass and stepped up onto a small white platform. She thanked the designers, the agency, the landlord, and then she thanked our mother and called her the only person who believed in this from the very first day. My mother came up beside her, slid an arm around her waist, looked out across the room, and then looked directly at me. There's one more person we should thank, she said, and the room turned. Delia has always preferred dirt and spreadsheets to actual life. A ripple of laughter. But even she finally understood which daughter was worth investing in. She lifted her glass higher. To Delia's little grape farm, it finally did something useful. And she laughed, and 120 people applauded me. Somebody was filming for the boutique's social media. The lens swung around and found my face. People were smiling at me with real affection, congratulating a generous sister, while I stood in a building made out of my grandmother's vines, holding stolen champagne. I felt the old thing rise up in me. That instinct. Keep the peace. Protect her image. Don't make a scene in front of the Hendersons. Feel it later, alone, in the car, where nobody has to be uncomfortable. 37 years of swallowing it. And then I thought about the heart emoji. You always find a way. I set the untouched glass on a passing tray. I walked up to the platform. My mother's face opened into a big, warm smile. She thought I was coming up to say something gracious. She actually shifted the microphone toward me. I leaned in close enough that it caught every word. "Tomorrow morning at 9, I said, "sign for the envelope, and read it alone." The applause fell apart in the middle, the way sound does when people stop trusting it. My mother's eyes went hard and small. Bree's smile stayed exactly where it was, but her hand closed around the edge of the podium so tightly the skin went white. I didn't explain. I turned around, thanked the young woman working the door, took my coat, and walked out onto the commons into the cold September air, while somebody's camera kept rolling behind me. Through the glass, I could hear my mother laughing too loudly, telling everyone I was being dramatic about a family surprise. In the parking garage, Priya answered on the first ring. Halcyon Shores Council had already voluntarily paused all site work pending a title investigation. The hearing was confirmed for Monday, 7:30 a.m. "Everything now depends on the documents holding up," she said. "Not on her confessing. She will never confess. Go home. Sleep." I slept 4 hours. And while my mother and my sister stayed until midnight, posing beside a gold logo, a courier's envelope moved through a sorting facility in Elmira. Inside it, my letter, on top of a certified copy of the forged deed, Gwen's affidavit, the domain registration record, the Charlottesville livestream certification, a forensic asset tracing schedule, and notice of an emergency hearing. She spent that whole night celebrating an opening. Every photograph she posted was documenting the location of property a court was about to freeze. At 7:25 Monday morning, I sat next to Priya in a nearly empty courtroom in Watkins Glen, wearing the same navy dress because I hadn't thought about clothes in 4 days. Halcyon's attorney appeared by video and stated on the record that his client would suspend all work and take no further action on title while the matter was investigated. I have never been so grateful to a stranger in a suit. The judge went through it slowly. The name that included a surname I hadn't legally used since 2019. The notary commission surrendered 19 months before the acknowledgement. The live stream. The hyphenated domain registered 19 days before the site visit. The power of attorney executed on a form nobody had signed. The $1.4 million deposit into an account in my mother's sole name, and the $260,000 that went from there to Saffron and Slate LTO. At 8:14 a.m., she signed a temporary restraining order. It barred any further alteration, clearing, construction, or transfer at Larkspur Hollow. It froze the remaining traceable balance of the sale proceeds. It prohibited Saffron and Slate from selling, moving, or encumbering high-value fixtures and inventory outside of normal monitored operations. And it recorded a notice of pendency against the property so that anyone in the world who looked at that title would see in public record that it was in litigation. It didn't decide the case. It did one thing. It made it impossible for my mother to make the damage permanent before a court could hear it. At 8:57, a courier knocked on my mother's front door in Watkins Glen and got her signature. At 9:03, my phone lit up. I set it on the counter and watched it ring until the screen went dark. Then Bree, then my mother again, then a number I didn't know, then my aunt. By 9:30, 22 missed calls. By 10:30, 87, 31 from my mother, 19 from Bree, and the rest from relatives who had received hysterical, edited versions of the story before they'd finished their coffee. I made myself a real breakfast. Eggs, toast, coffee. I sat down, and then I listened to the first voicemail. My mother began in tears. She said it had all been a misunderstanding about paperwork. She said she had always intended to pay me back, that she'd been planning to sit down with me after the opening and work out a schedule. Then her breathing steadied, and the performance ended, and the real voice came through. She said I was cruel. She said I had waited on purpose, that I had let my sister spend the money and hire employees and sign a lease just so the fall would be worse. She said I had humiliated Bree in front of the entire business community out of jealousy. And in the last 11 seconds, panic finally beat theater. You can't touch the store. Bree already signed personal guarantees on the suppliers. If the bank freezes that account, she loses everything. Delia, you need to call me before people find out what you've done. Before people find out what you've done. Not what she did. What I'd done, which was to write it down. Bree's voicemail came next. She said she'd always believed I would eventually approve, so it wasn't really lying. She said the heart emoji proves nothing. She listed her 4 employees by name. She described the lease term, the supplier orders, the press coverage. She talked for 2 minutes and 40 seconds and never once said she was sorry that the money was mine. My mother's 3rd message didn't plead at all. It said, your grandmother would be ashamed of you, choosing property over your own family. That's where I stopped listening. Because I hadn't chosen property over family, my mother had chosen a storefront over my consent, over my grandmother's will, over a notary's career, over 6 people's paychecks, over the law of New York State. She called it love, because love sounds so much better than favoritism when you say it out loud in front of company. Let me ask you something. And I really do want to know, which one do you think hurts more, being betrayed in silence, or being publicly thanked for the thing that was stolen from you? I muted every Shanley member in my phone except Priya, and I drove out to Hector. Marisol and the whole crew were waiting by the press house. Somebody had heard something. Everybody had heard something. I read them the order out loud, standing on the loading dock in the wind, and I told them the truth. The vineyard was protected while the court sorted out title. Nobody was losing a job, and harvest was starting Wednesday whether the world was fair or not. Nobody cheered. I want to be honest about that, too. There was no music, no fists in the air. Rafe asked if the health insurance was still active. Marisol asked whether we'd lost the Cabernet Franc contract with the winery in Geneva. The vines still needed picking. The crew still needed certainty. And a developer 300 miles away was out real money because of my mother. That is what winning actually feels like, not fireworks. It felt like finally refusing to absorb the cost by myself so everyone around me could stay comfortable. The rest moved faster than any of us expected, because fraud collapses fast once daylight gets under it. By that afternoon, the landlord on the Commons had been served with the preservation order. The title insurer opened a fraud investigation of its own. The lifestyle reporter who'd written a glowing piece about the Finger Lakes' newest luxury destination pulled it down and replaced it with 2 sentences noting the store's financing was subject to a legal dispute. But the opening night photos stayed online for weeks, and there was one in particular that everybody ended up seeing: my mother, frozen mid-laugh, glass raised, arm around my sister, turned toward the camera in triumph. That photograph became the single most quoted piece of evidence in Schuyler County, not in court, just in the way people looked at her at the grocery store. 9 days later, she demanded a family meeting. I agreed on exactly one condition. It happened in Priya's conference room, and it was recorded. My mother arrived in her good coat, with her hair done, as though presentation could still restore authority. Bree came with her fiancé, Owen. My mother put my letter on the table and said there were mistakes in how this paperwork was handled. Priya slid the deed next to Gwen's affidavit, then laid out the domain registration, the escrow correspondence, and the license scan. Then she said, in the flattest voice I've ever heard, Mrs. Hartley, paperwork mistakes don't register a fraudulent domain. Invent a fellowship in New Zealand. Use a surrendered notary seal, or move $1.4 million. My mother looked at me, and she said the true thing finally, the thing underneath all of it. Your grandmother tore this family in half when she left that land to one granddaughter. I corrected it. I put the money somewhere it could actually build a future instead of sitting in the ground. I said there were 6 people employed on that ground, there were contracts, there was a conservation plan. She said, you'll always earn more, Delia. You're capable. Bree needed a start. And there it was. 37 years explained in 11 words. My competence had never earned me respect in that family. It had only ever made me easier to rob. Then Bree said she hadn't known about the forgery, that she'd been kept in the dark. I slid her own email across the table. Send our portion first. The opening date can't move. And under it, the loan application she'd submitted to a supplier, where she had described the source of her capital as proceeds from a family vineyard sale being finalized without the owner's direct participation, and certified that statement as true, with her signature at the bottom, her real one. Owen picked up that page, he read it twice, and then he stood up, walked to the far end of the room, and sat down in a different chair. I gave my conditions, and Pryor wrote them down as I said them. Title restored to me. Halcyon Shores made whole. Every traceable dollar returned. All boutique assets purchased with those proceeds held under court supervision until a receiver could identify them. My mother writes a correction, in her own name, in writing, to every relative, vendor, employee, and guest she'd lied to. Neither of them sets foot on Larkspur Hollow without my written permission. And one more. I told them I would inform the district attorney's office that I preferred restitution to incarceration, but I would not withdraw a single document, and I would never in any forum describe a forged deed as a family misunderstanding. My mother pushed back her chair and said, "You're asking me to lose my home." I said, "You sold mine." Bree said closing the store would end her career before it started. I said 6 people found out from a stranger in a reflective vest that their workplace was going to be bulldozed. Owen left before the meeting was over. Bree followed him into the hallway, and I could hear her through the door. He didn't come back. And my mother sat there in her good coat, in a room where nobody was performing for her, and for the first time in my entire life she looked small. It took 9 months, forensic accounting, 2 rounds of mediation, a quiet title action, and 1 deposition where my mother cried for 11 minutes and answered every question anyway because a court reporter doesn't care about crying. The deed was declared void, not reversed, void. It never legally existed because she never had the authority to transfer 1 square foot of it. Halcyon Shores released all claims once the title insurer paid out, and their development director sent me a 2-line note that I still have. The money was less forgiving. Of $1.4 million, the freeze preserved $681,000. The rest had been spent, wired, or committed. Restitution meant my mother liquidated her investment account, surrendered nearly all of her retirement savings, and sold the 4-bedroom house on the hill where she had hosted 23 years of Thanksgivings. After the mortgage payoff, the taxes, and the settlement, she moved into a 1-bedroom apartment above a laundromat on Franklin Street. Everything that didn't fit went to an estate auction on a Saturday morning. For her entire adult life, my mother measured her security by what could be displayed on a surface. Now every object she owned had to earn its square footage. Saffron and slate lasted 11 weeks. I want to be very clear because people have accused me of this. I did not close my sister's store. A receiver identified the fixtures and inventory as traceable proceeds. The landlord terminated the lease over missed rent and a breach disclosure clause in her own application. 2 suppliers enforced the personal guarantees she had signed without reading. The gold awning came down on a Tuesday in December, and the inventory was auctioned, and the proceeds went to restitution. That store didn't die of revenge. It died of arithmetic. It had never once been able to pay for itself. Bree came out of it personally liable for $78,000 on a 5-year repayment plan. She's an assistant manager at a clothing chain in an outlet mall near Horseheads now. It's honest work, and she's reportedly good at it, and she hates it. Not because it's beneath her, but because she has to report to someone who never confused wanting a thing with having earned it. Owen ended the engagement in November, after she asked him to refinance his condo to save the store. She told everyone that was my fault. He told me, in one text I never answered, that the court documents had shown him a version of her he couldn't unsee. The district attorney's office would not simply drop a publicly recorded forged deed, no matter what I preferred. My mother avoided prison because she had no criminal history, made full restitution, and eventually, after 4 months of not doing so, cooperated. She received 3 years of supervised probation, 600 hours of community service, mandatory financial crimes counseling, and a lifetime bar on serving as anyone's fiduciary trustee or power of attorney. Bree entered a diversion program for the false financing statement, completed the classes and the service hours, and kept the debt. Not going to prison is not the same as not facing consequences. And honestly, the apartment wasn't the part that broke her. The correction letter was, she had to send it to 120 guests, the Merchants Association, our extended family, and the Vineyard crew, a plain statement in her own words that I had never consented to the sale of Larkspur Hollow, that the deed bearing my signature was forged, and that the store had been funded with the proceeds. The Merchants Association removed her from its board. 2 couples she vacationed with for 15 years stopped inviting her to anything, and people forwarded that letter attached to that photograph. My mother mid-laugh, glass raised, it finally did something useful over and over all winter. She had wanted a public triumph. She got a permanent public record of the 90 seconds before her story fell apart. At the final mediation, she asked for 5 minutes alone with me. Priya waited on the other side of the glass door with her arms folded. My mother didn't cry at first, she said. I think I spent your whole childhood believing that the daughter who asked for less felt less. I waited. She said, your sister needed me every single week. You never needed me at all, and I told myself that made me a good mother to her, but it just made me feel necessary. You made me feel, she stopped and looked at the table, irrelevant, since you were 15 years old, she said. So I punished you for surviving without me, and I called it fairness. That was the first fully true thing my mother had said to me in 20 years, and I'm grateful I got to hear it. And I told her the truth back, that understanding a motive doesn't dissolve a choice, that she didn't fall into fraud in a moment of panic. She walked into it one deliberate step at a time, taking the key, scanning the license, registering the domain, filling in the blank form, tracing the signature, lying to the escrow officer about a fellowship in New Zealand, lying to Marisol in the press house, and then raising a glass in a room full of people who loved her. 9 separate decisions, 9 separate chances to stop. She started to cry then, and I sat there and let her, and I didn't reach across the table. I've thought about that a lot. It felt cruel in the moment, but some tears belong entirely to the person who caused the damage. And picking them up for her would have been the 10,000th time I did her emotional work for free. I signed the settlement once I'd confirmed 3 things. The title was clear, the crew was protected, and Halcyon's losses were covered. I declined the additional punitive damages my lawyer could have pursued, the ones that would have followed my mother into her 70s. I didn't return $1 of restitution, and I didn't rescue my sister from a guarantee she'd signed with her own hand. That's what I finally learned mercy actually is. It isn't restoring someone else's comfort at your own expense. It's letting the consequences stop exactly where the accountability ends, and not 1 inch sooner. The first harvest after Larkspur Hollow came back to me started 11 months after that grand opening on a cold, bright morning in the 3rd week of September. We'd lost a full season of planning, 2 contracts, and 8 months of our regenerative certification timeline. Insurance and legal fees ate most of the recovered cash. But we had not lost the vines, not 1 row, not even Dahlia's rows, which the surveyors had flagged but never touched. I made Marisol operations director and gave her equity. I restored the 2 months of benefits the crew had lost during the freeze out of my own pocket, retroactive. I rewrote the redevelopment plan so the vineyard could stay profitable at its actual size without ever having to sell its identity to a resort company. And I set up something I'd been thinking about since the day I stood in that site trailer, the Adelaide Hartley Fund. Every year it pays 2 young agricultural workers, kids from Schuyler and Yates County, to spend a full season learning soil restoration, water management, and cold climate viticulture with a stipend that lets them actually afford to learn. My inheritance stopped being something I defended. It became something I got to hand outward. I also changed every system that had allowed family access to quietly become business authority. My mother's key was destroyed with a pair of bolt cutters in my driveway. Every account requires dual approval. My identification lives in a safe deposit box. My signature is registered with the county clerk. And Priya helped me place all 22 acres under a conservation easement, so no future transfer can be recorded without independent review by a third party who does not love anybody involved. None of that is romantic. Nobody writes songs about dual approval banking, but it's care. It's the most serious form of care I know. My grandmother trusted my judgment, and honoring her meant building something sturdier than trust. I kept a certified copy of the forged deed in a locked file, not as a trophy, as a reminder that love without boundaries can be rewritten into permission by anybody determined enough to hold the pen. We had the harvest dinner on the last Saturday in October, at 2 long tables set up on the gravel between the barn and the press house, with string lights and 40 people and somebody's dog under the table. The crew came with their families. Marisol's mother brought tamales. Priya drove 2 hours and stayed until midnight. Neighboring growers came. So did the development director from Halcyon Shores, the man in the fleece vest who halted his own company's project on nothing but a photograph and a stranger's word, and who, I later learned, took real professional heat for doing it. I did not invite my mother. I did not invite Bree. That absence wasn't a statement. Nobody announced it. It was just a boundary, and boundaries are quiet. My family had spent 37 years treating my presence as guaranteed and my property as negotiable. I don't offer either one anymore without trust, and trust is now a thing people build with me over time like a soil profile. At sunset, right as the light went gold over the lake, my phone buzzed in my jacket. It was my mother. I would like to come see the vineyard. Not to talk about any of it. I just want to stand where your grandmother stood. A year earlier, that message would have gutted me. I would have read it 11 times, felt sick, and said yes, and then spent the whole visit managing everybody's feelings but my own. This time I read it once, standing there with a glass of my own Riesling in my hand, and I noticed something remarkable. I felt guilt, and I could tell it apart from obligation. They're not the same thing. They've never been the same thing. I just never learned where one ended. I typed, "No, this land doesn't have room for people who couldn't tell what it was worth." Then I put the phone in my pocket and went back to the table, and Rafah's daughter was telling a story about a raccoon in the fermentation shed, and everybody was laughing, and I laughed too. I didn't feel victorious. I want to be honest with you, all the way to the end. I felt clear. That's all, clear, the way the lake goes in November. For most of my life, my mother relied on one thing, the delay. The gap between the moment she hurt me and the moment I was willing to say so out loud. That gap was where she lived. That gap was her entire strategy. The gap is gone. Bree never reopened. For a few months, she posted things about betrayal and jealous relatives and how you find out who your real family is. And every time, somebody in the comments would attach the correction letter, and the sympathy got a little thinner. Eventually, she stopped posting. 2 years into her repayment plan, she sent me a message. 4 sentences, no request for money. She wrote that she had known enough to stop it, that she chose not to ask the questions she could have asked, and that the store had mattered more to her at the time than where the money came from. She said she was sorry. I wrote back, "Thank you for saying that. I believe you." And then nothing else, because an apology can begin a repair, but it doesn't get to set the injured person's deadline, maybe someday. She's 29 years old with a 5-year plan and a manager who makes her show up. That might do more for her than $260,000 ever could have. My relationship with my mother is limited and formal now. We exchange short messages about real emergencies. Her probation ended last spring. The boundary didn't. She spent decades believing consequences were temporary obstacles that my competence would eventually solve for her. And the single most important consequence of all of this was her learning that I won't. That letter didn't destroy my family. I need you to hear that, especially if you're standing where I was standing. It exposed a version of family that required one woman to hand over her rights so another woman could keep dreaming. That version deserved to fall apart. What's left is smaller and truer, and it includes Marisol and the crew and Priya and 41,000 vines on a slope above a lake. My mother lost the house, most of her retirement, her seat on the board, and the authority she'd used her whole life to decide who deserved what. My sister lost the store, the engagement, and the fantasy that enthusiasm can stand in for responsibility. I got Larkspur Hollow back, but I got something else, something I didn't know had been taken, the right to tell my own story without asking the people who hurt me to approve the wording first. My grandmother told me that attention, not ownership, is what decides whether land outlives its owner. I've come to think the same thing is true of self-respect. It doesn't survive because you feel it. It survives because you protect it, in writing, with the locks changed, before somebody else decides it was always available for trade. So let me leave you with the question I've been asked more than any other since this happened, and I genuinely want your answer in the comments. If you had to choose between keeping the peace in your family and protecting what was legally, rightfully yours, would you stay quiet until your evidence was complete, or would you confront them the second you found out? I chose the paperwork. 12 of the hardest days of my life, smiling at people I loved while a courier drove across a county line. And I would choose it again tomorrow. Thank you for staying to the end of this one. The story is entirely fictional, written for dramatic storytelling, but if it left you with anything, let it be this. Your future does not have to be built around the people who refuse to honor your past. You are allowed to start again, and you are allowed to do it without carrying everyone who disappointed you into the next chapter.